The first 4 questions this week all come from Paul. So the first question he asked was, "Hey man, like, what do I think about some evidence-based practitioners suggesting that adding sets each and every week isn't the best idea?" And of course, this is complete speculation, and I don't want to speak for those individuals. And he mentioned a couple of individuals that I highly respect in this field and stuff. And I just think it's a difference. I don't. I think that the way that they approach it is more so, hey, we're gonna have this athlete do an effective stimulus somewhere between their minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable volume, and we're just kind of stay there until we start seeing progress go in the other direction, or things don't go as well, or recovery's hurt, and then we'll adjust from there. And by definition, if they are doing an effective dose of training, then you're going to progress doing that route and heading that route. And I think that that is a very reasonable way to program. Like, in some cases, I think that maintaining set volumes from week to week reduces some of the noise in tracking progress and stuff like that. And from a coaching perspective, I think it can actually make it a little bit easier. And I think it's clearly evidenced by some of these individuals that you can get very good results by taking this approach. However, when I think about taking this approach, and when I think about the methods I use, there's one thing that I have a hard time answering, or my defense to this would be kind of one main thing, and that is, with a lot of the research, it tends to suggest that more recoverable volume throughout the week tends to be better for hypertrophy. Of course, we hit that point to where the dose of training is too much, and maybe we do some junk volume in one session or stuff like that. But I think that the more recoverable volume that we can do, probably the better. And I think that from week to week to week across a training program, you're going to be increasing your recovery capacity because you are taking advantage of kind of the repeated bout effect, which is like fancy talk for, how when you start a mesocycle and you do like 1 or 2 sets of lunges and you're sore for like 4 days, but then the next week you do the same exact stimulus and you're not sore at all. That's kind of the repeated bout effect. And I think that if your recovery capabilities increase from week to week, then you're potentially leaving gains on the table if you're not doing a little bit more volume that you could potentially recover from. Now, I do think that there's a very good point to where some people get to a level of advancement to where it might be hard to actually accumulate a ton from week to week to week. Now, there's also anecdotal evidence from like Steve Hall and Mike Israetel and Jared Feather and some of those very advanced people that they can still add sets week to week to week and benefit from it. So I do think that there's a chance that the more trained you get, maybe the tighter that window is between your MEV and MRV, so maybe your accumulation isn't as large. But to me, the biggest thing that I have a tough time getting around when you're solely focused on hypertrophy is that, hey, more recoverable volume seems to be better. So if you can objectively say that you're recovering from a stimulus and you can kind of take advantage of that repeated bout effect from week to week to week, I think that that makes the most sense for hypertrophy. All right, which doesn't mean that hanging around between your MEV and MRV is wrong or anything like that. I think that's a solid approach. All right, so hopefully that answers your question there. Next question, weighted stretch and isometric holds for hypertrophy. Well, I think two main things with this one. For one, I think that both of these would accomplish increasing the stress on the muscle. And at the end of the day, we are looking for a training stress on the muscle to elicit growth, which isn't so much to where we can't recover from it. So if you're doing a weighted stretch or isometric holds, I don't think I'm as much of a fan as isometric holds. I think that actually taking the muscle through a range of motion or stretching under load like a weighted stretch is probably a little bit better. But at the end of the day, I think that both of them might be forms of just adding stress to the muscle. And as long as you adjust your training stress based on how you're recovering, how you're responding, and that sort of thing, then I think that they can be useful. Now, regarding the weighted stretch, there's some evidence that there could be some hyperplasia going on. So that is the increase in the number of muscle fibers rather than just the size of the muscle fiber. And man, I don't know. I wouldn't say that there's like strong evidence that hyperplasia does not occur. And I would say in animal models, hey, it seems like it does occur. And, maybe for very trained lifters, maybe hyperplasia becomes more of an avenue for muscle growth. Maybe. I don't think there's strong evidence for that, but I don't think that is necessarily something that couldn't happen. Which, maybe with a lot of these advanced trainees that like to do some of these intensity techniques, maybe there's some of that effect going on. I'm open to that suggestion. However, I still think that, cycling your volume between your MEV and your MRV and just doing traditional training still works for more advanced trainees, as evidenced by some people in the Revive Stronger crowd. So, with weighted stretching, I would say that it's another form of adding stress to the muscle, and as long as you make sure that your stress on your muscle is effective but yet not too much, it could be something to do. And hey, maybe it does help with hyperplasia, which might benefit muscle growth over the long term. Now, I would also say that weighted stretching probably doesn't have the best stimulus to fatigue ratio. I could literally load up a barbell and do one rep with RDLs and just sit in that stretched position and really stretch my hamstrings. And I could probably get sore from that. But man, I'm just not sure how much I would actually grow from that single rep. So I think that would cause a lot of damage. And hey, maybe there's a time and place for doing weighted stretches periodically, maybe before more rest type phases and stuff like that, or at the end of training sessions. I don't think it's the worst idea, and I think that it could potentially have some application, but I kind of have a hunch that at the end of the day, all it's doing is very similar to traditional training, to where you're just applying an effective stress on the muscle. All right, so hopefully that kind of answers that there. Next question, 4-week lower volume maintenance versus 2 weeks of active recovery for resensitization. I think this is a very good question. I don't know. Intuitively, I would say that I feel like both approaches would resensitize you to a similar degree. Now, Would you potentially get the fiber type transitioning and stuff like that from the 2-week active recovery phase? Maybe not, but are you really going to get that much of a fiber type transitioning from just 4 weeks of lower volume maintenance kind of strength work? Maybe not a whole lot. Although some studies, over the courses of like a couple of mesocycles suggest transitioning and stuff. But I think that both probably have their place. And I think that here's how I would decide when to use one or the other. All right. So my thought process is if someone has been running multiple mesocycles of hypertrophy training and they start reporting to me that, man, I'm starting to get fatigued earlier on in my mesocycles, like in week 2 and 3, I'm starting to notice disruptions in sleep. My performance starts to feel meh. My motivation isn't there. My pumps just don't feel as good. I'm feeling that earlier and earlier in mesocycles. Or I finish my deload and I still don't feel quite right. In those situations, I kind of like the active rest approach because that kind of tells me that, hey, maybe it's more so a fatigue and just accumulated fatigue thing, and having 2 weeks of active rest can kind of cure that. But if someone tells me that, hey, I just don't feel very motivated for hypertrophy training anymore, I'm not progressing well, like my strength isn't really increasing much, my pumps have been kind of dog shit the entire mesocycle, and it just seems like they are more resistant to the training, to the hypertrophic stimulus, then I might lean towards a longer primer or resensitization phase. So I guess what I'm saying is that I view kind of the 4 or 5 week lower volume phase as more of a resensitization, and a 2 week active rest as more so a rest. So, or fatigue drop. So I view the active rest phase more so in situations to where you're just feeling fatigued early on in a mesocycle, and I might take the resensitization approach when you feel like, man, my pumps aren't as good, maybe your motivation for hypertrophy training is down. Well, that could be also tied to fatigue and stuff like that. But maybe your pumps aren't as good. It's taking a lot of volume for you to get sore. That's a good one. Or maybe you're noticing that your MEV is just getting really high from meso to meso. Okay, in that situation, maybe a 4 week kind of primer would be a better approach. But if you're just noticing like, I'm still getting like a pretty good stimulus from lower volumes and stuff like that, I just feel like my mesocycles are getting really short here, I don't feel quite right after my deload, then you might go the active rest phase. And in general, I tend to use kind of lower volume maintenance phases, kind of following a standard diet, not necessarily like a contest prep, but kind of a standard diet to kind of allow you to recover from the diet, put you in a good spot for massing. And then I like the active rest phases more so to break up gaining phases. So let's say you do 3 or 4 mesocycles of hypertrophy, you're still pretty lean, you're in a good spot, but you're just feeling some of that fatigue. Okay, then maybe we do an active rest. All right, so I hope that kind of helps you out and explains my thought process behind those two different approaches. And Paul's final question is regarding reps in reserve across the mesocycle. So how would you compare 1 rep in reserve, 1 rep in reserve, 1 rep in reserve, and then training to failure in the 4th week compared to 3 reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, 1 rep in reserve, 0 reps in reserve? I would say the latter, going 3, 2, 1, 0, makes more sense from a fatigue management standpoint, and it may allow for more total effective volume to be done throughout the mesocycle, is what I would say. However, that's a big ask from some clients. And if I can get some clients to go like 2 reps in reserve week 1, then go 1, 1, 0, that's pretty good. Because with reps in reserve, I think that what we're trying to do is maximize the stimulus to fatigue ratio. And I think that on average, 1 to 2 reps in reserve probably gets you that really good stimulus for less fatigue. And if you're able to do that, then maybe you can recover from more total recoverable volume, which, like I said earlier, is probably beneficial for hypertrophy. So I would say the latter of 3 to 0 across the mesocycle is probably a little bit better approach. But man, even if you're keeping 1 rep in reserve each week up until the final week, you're still managing fatigue to some degree. Is it as good, or are you getting as good of a stimulus to fatigue ratio as going from 3 to 0? Probably not. But are you still going to benefit from that? Yeah. And is it going to be the end of the world if you do that compared to 3 to 0? No, I don't think so. All right? So hope that helps there, Paul. And I'm sure they were all really good questions, so I was happy to include them all. So appreciate it, Paul. Now, next couple of questions pulled from Instagram. And this one is protein before bed. Is that a good idea? And what do I think about having casein versus whey? Like, does it make a big difference? And I think that protein before bed has a very good kind of cost to benefit ratio. I think for most people, it's very easy to do, to just have some protein before bed. And I think that research does suggest that, hey, having some protein before bed might elevate muscle protein synthesis throughout the night, and it probably doesn't have a large effect on sleep. Like, it probably doesn't hamper sleep a whole lot. And it's probably a good idea for muscle mass and strength gains. So I think that having some protein before bed is kind of a decent idea. Now, if you are already hitting your daily protein numbers and you are comparing, say you're having 200 grams of protein a day, but you don't have a meal within 3 hours before bed, compared to 200 grams of protein per day and having a meal right before bed, man, I think the differences are going to be very slight and very small, especially over the long term. I think both approaches are going to be probably fine. So then but I do think that a little bit of protein before bed, hey, why not? Especially if it doesn't like hurt sleep and you don't notice any effect on sleep. Now, should you have casein or whey? Well, I think that it would make a little bit more sense to have casein, to have a larger time under the curve of kind of muscle protein synthesis, to have a longer elevation. So I think that, and the cost to benefit of that is like, it's probably not any more difficult to have some casein protein before bed compared to whey, or just a whole food source. Whole food sources are going to digest relatively slow. And the individual that asked me this further elaborated and said that what he does is, I think he has oats and yogurt and mixes whey protein in with his yogurt. Dude, totally fine. Because having that oats, having that yogurt is going to slow down digestion regardless. And I think he had some oil in there too, so a fat source. So you're going to be totally fine. And the difference in that situation between mixing in whey versus casein, not enough to worry about. All right, so in general, protein before bed, probably a pretty decent idea. Casein versus whey, probably a decent idea to have casein if you're having protein in isolation. But if you're having a mixed meal, then, man, I don't think it's going to have a big enough difference to worry about. All right, so I hope that helps. And then the final question was regarding whey hydrolysate, and if it would be worth it to have that if you're training like twice a day. And essentially, you have like 3 different forms of whey protein. You have whey concentrate, whey isolate, and whey hydrolysate. And whey concentrate, I think it's usually around like 80% whey protein, and then the rest can come up from carbs and fats. So from a 20 gram serving size, you might have like 14 or 15 grams of protein, and then it might be some other stuff. So it's less kind of isolated. But I think that by definition, it can be as low as like 35 or 50%. But I think most proteins, even concentrates, have like 80, 85% somewhere in there. And then a whey isolate is, I believe, at least 90%. It might be 85, somewhere in there. So it's more of an isolated protein and just protein alone. But then a hydrolysate is a protein that has been hydrolyzed. Makes sense. And what that basically is, like, to me, this is a gross way to describe it, but probably makes sense, is that it is kind of like a pre-digested protein. So it's broken down a little bit more. It's hydrolyzed, which is just breaking it down a little bit more, which can be beneficial for making it a little easier to digest and maybe potentially absorb a little bit faster. Although I feel like I remember seeing a study that compared isolate to hydrolysate, and the absorption rates weren't actually that different. So I'm not entirely sure there. And I think that even if you're training twice a day, I probably wouldn't spend the money on a hydrolysate compared to an isolate. And I don't think that the differences are going to matter a whole lot. And if you're training twice a day, you're going to be eating protein 4 or 5 times a day and having an effective dose of protein in each bolus of protein that you have. So you're probably already going to have elevations in amino acids throughout the entire day, and having a hydrolysate versus an isolate probably isn't going to matter a whole lot. Now, one application might be if you sip on protein during your training session, hey, maybe a hydrolysate would be easier on your stomach. Or if protein shakes in general, it hurts your stomach or something like that, hey, maybe a hydrolysate might not be a bad route. But for the sole purposes of kind of absorption rates and stuff like that, I don't see much of an application for that. All right? So that is the Q&A this week. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next Sunday.